Ocala's information station, 1370 WOCA. Ocala.
All right, 23 minutes before 11 o'clock. Thank you for tuning in. I want to introduce our next guest by telling a story on the air that I have told before, but I want to tell it again. And this goes back to a few years when I worked at an assisted living facility. And the facility had two sections. One section of people who did not seem to be affected by Alzheimer's and other dementia, and the other section where people did have some form of dementia or Alzheimer's. That section was locked up. The other section, people could freely come and go as they wanted. There was a lady living in the non-dementia section who had been a very accomplished nurse, who was very fun to be with and very friendly. And then I watched as she slowly succumbed to some form of dementia. One day I was walking past the area where the dementia folks were living, and I could hear somebody screaming, not like in pain, but just like almost like singing with one note, but very high-pitched singing. And I opened the door to see what it was. And it was this lady, and she was in a wheelchair, and she had her arm straight up in the air, and she was just having this one note the whole time. I mean, just nonstop. Her name was Ruth. I hope you don't mind that I tell you her first name. She's probably not listening, probably not even alive anymore. But anyway, I said, Ruth, what's the matter? What's the matter? And the ladies who worked with her said, there's nothing you can do. She's just going to keep doing that. There's nothing you can say. Well, Ruth used to tell me dirty jokes. I hope she doesn't mind me telling you this. And they were funny dirty jokes, okay? And I got down and I said, she must be in there somewhere. She must be in there somewhere. She loved dirty jokes. So I had just heard one. And I got down and I told her this dirty joke. And don't ask me what it was. I can't remember. But she laughed. She brought her arm down and she thought it was funny. And the girls who worked in that side of the building, they thought, oh my gosh, what did you say to her to make her stop? And I said, I told her a dirty joke. And they thought that was weird, That's kind of creepy. You're telling her. I said, no, we go back a long way. You don't understand. That's something she used to love doing. And unfortunately, she did go back to screaming and to having her arm up in the air. But for that one brief moment, I saw something that I never had validated until now through this book called Into the Gray Zone. This helps me understand what I witnessed in that moment, and maybe will help you understand some of the people you're dealing with and living with right now. Adrian Owen, what an amazing book. It's called Into the Gray Zone. He's the author of the book. He is a neuroscientist. He spent the last 20 years pioneering breakthroughs in cognitive neuroscience. He is the Canada Excellence Research Chair in Cognitive Neuroscience and Imaging at the Brain and Mind Institute at Western University, Canada. He's got all kinds of credentials. I would spend more time in the intro than we really need to, but I wanted to tell that story. It made the intro rather long. Adrian Owen, what an honor, and thank you so much for being on the air with us today.
Thanks for having me on. Your introduction was actually absolutely a perfect introduction to the book, because you touched on many of the themes that I've tried to pack into that book.
And that's what made me think of it, because I'm talking about something that probably happened 20 years ago, and but I never forgot it. And every time I meet somebody who is, I don't know, going through Alzheimer's, or maybe even an autistic a child or something, I always think, well, they're in there somewhere. And your book seems to say that we're in there.
Well, that's right. Well, what I try to do is to explore the difference between being a person and what point you sort of cease to become the person that you once were. And the condition that you described there is one of the gray zone states that I refer to in the book. And there are many different conditions where it's no longer apparent whether people are in there or not. And you mentioned this happened 20 years ago. Well, the story that I tell in the book actually unravels over a 20-year period, because 20 years ago most of us thought that none of these patients were there. None of them had anything going on, and that, the general, the prevailing clinical opinion was that there really wasn't much we could do for them, but
right.
As you've described, sort of lock them up or warehouse them. And actually, the situation today, is very different. And the story in the book really unpacks how that has occurred and how science has gradually taught us that many of these people do have inner lives. They do have personalities and even opinions about what should happen to them.
Isn't that interesting? I wonder, you must have entered into the research with a notion of what you were going to discover. Did the things you discover in the research change your mind about anything, or give you information that you didn't expect or you didn't see coming?
It's funny you should ask that. I can't say I ever had a plan. I didn't set out to do this. I can say that along the way, I've had this sort of niggling doubt, as you clearly have too, about many of these patients and many of these situations. And one thing that drove me to develop the technology that we now use to communicate with some of these patients was this nagging doubt that it can't be true. It can't be that as these patients degenerate or as their brains get impacted by a traumatic brain injury, it can't be that everything just switches off instantly. It just doesn't make neuroscientific sense. And that's one of the things that sort of drove me in the direction of trying to find out what can they do.
Right.
And my opinion has completely changed. I can't believe how far we've come in 20 years.
Did it give you any insight into what happens after death, or is that a different subject?
I think it's a different subject. I mean, I think it tells us that there's life this side of death that in some cases is worth living. I mean, one of the other themes that comes out in the book is what it's like to be a patient in this situation, and a point that I make is that it's not necessarily the nightmare scenario that we all imagine it might be. Certainly, it's the case that many of these patients are able to derive some satisfaction from their lives. Many even report having being happy in some senses, and certainly the majority don't report that they want to die, which I think would be very surprising to most people, because many of us think of this as being a fate worse than death. But actually, it turns out that when you get into that situation, it's maybe not quite as bad as we think it might be.
Can you include people that have bipolar in your research to see if they can also be helped? Because sometimes we hear that bipolar patients have to be on medication, and then if they refuse to take it anymore, they go off the deep end.
So actually, my research is much broader than the research that is described in Into the Grey Zone, and we've certainly used some of the scanning technology, the brain scanning technology that we've used and developed to try and understand a little bit more about what happens in the brains of, for example, people who have bipolar disorder, because I think these are very interesting questions, and the questions, again, going back to how far we've come. These are questions that we can only address now. These were things that were impossible 20 years ago because we just didn't have the technology. And I think many of the answers are only starting to come through now, and as people find clinical applications, I mean, the science, I think, has reached a point where we can apply it in various clinical situations, and the one you've just described is one of them. And I think it'll be a few years before we know all the answers, but we're certainly on the road.
Does it differentiate in people depending on what is a source of stimulation for them? For example, somebody who gets joy out of building things or playing a musical instrument or throwing a ball, physical activity, as opposed to somebody who has all of his life maybe been stimulated by reading a book or by stimulation that is mental in nature. Do those two different people, the one stimulated by mental stimulation and the one stimulated by physical stimulation, do they report different levels of contentment, if you know what I mean? I would think that a physical person would be not so happy to be in a body that's not working anymore.
I think this situation is so fundamentally different for all of these patients. I mean, to go from a situation where you can walk, talk, communicate, socialize, express your emotions, to a situation in which you can do none of those things. And most of the patients that I weave the story about in the book are thought of as being in a vegetative state. And that means that they don't do anything. They don't respond to anything. They won't squeeze your hand if you ask them to squeeze it. They won't move your eyes. They won't blink. Wow. They have eyes open, and they'll look around the room. They might grunt and groan occasionally. They may fall asleep and wake up, but they won't respond to any form of external stimulation. Now that's, yes, fundamentally a physical change. They've gone from moving around, moving through the world, to not being able to move at all, or at least not voluntarily. But, a lot of the other more mental stuff has also been taken away from them. They can't interact, they can't socialize, they can't play a musical instrument, they can't even choose what music they listen to at any particular point in time. So actually, I think the experience for most of these patients, regardless of what their interests were previously, is much the same, because it's such a fundamental change in your living conditions.
I have a friend who was in an accident, and he was in a coma for a while, and his wife was at his bedside quite frequently. And after he came out of the coma, he told everybody that he heard everything. And hopefully this isn't too adult for this audience, but he said that he felt like he got an erection a lot. And his wife told him, no, you never did. So in his mind, he was hearing everything and responding to everything, and felt like he was physically reacting to certain things. But apparently he wasn't. Apparently he was just like a noodle on a bed. That's what it sounded like, the way his wife described it. And I just wondered, do those types of studies, obviously they seem to support what you're saying, but are they included in what you're saying?
They are. I mean, this is why I refer to this as the grey zone, because there really is a disconnect that we don't understand between the patient and the patient's experiences and what's actually going on in the outside world. So in the book, I describe a case of a patient here in Canada who came to us apparently in a vegetative state. We threw everything we had at him. We did every scan, every type of investigation we possibly could. We sent him home with the message, "Yep, we don't think there's anything going on." He probably is completely unaware. 9 months later, he returned. He walked back into my lab. And not only had he recovered, but he was able to tell us everything that happened 9 months earlier when he was there. He told us going into the scanner. He told us about the names of the people who had scanned him. He remembered things that I didn't even remember, right? Because that's all he had to do at the time. He was sitting there experiencing every single moment and remembering it. And one of the things he said, your story reminds me, is, you put me into the scanner and I cried. And now we know he didn't cry at the time, because we had cameras on the patients, and we were monitoring very carefully, make sure they're as comfortable as they can possibly be. But his experience was fear and tears. And physically in the outside world, that's not what was actually happening. And his story is absolutely remarkable. The patient who came back from that situation and lived to tell the tale.
When people report near-death experiences and they say they were up on the ceiling looking down, is that part of this too? I mean, does the same thing seem to be part of this whole study?
It is. I mean, I do get into this, but this isn't a science book. But I'm very careful to describe what we know about the science, because there are a lot of reports like the one that you've just described. And anesthesia is something that I talk about. That's a situation that, unlike vegetative state, that's a situation that many of us will have during our lives. If you have your appendix removed, you might go and have a general anesthetic, and that's also a grey zone, because you start off fully awake and fully aware, and you end up hopefully completely unaware of what's going on as somebody rummages around inside you.
Yeah, right.
And somewhere in between those two things, you're in a gray zone state. And so-called anesthetic awareness is surprisingly common. People reporting that they had some awareness of what was going on during the surgery. And in some of those cases, patients report so-called near-death experiences where, as you say, they're somewhere else in the room and they're witnessing this from somewhere else. And I mean, I strongly suspect that isn't happening. I don't think there's any scientific evidence to believe that the person is in some senses outside of the body. But we do know that these states put you into a really, I guess, altered state of consciousness where things can seem very screwed up and weird. Yeah. And I think that's, certainly people do have awareness in those situations, but I don't think there's any good evidence that they are, elsewhere in the room, as it were.
Gotcha. Yeah. Into the Gray Zone is the title of the book. Adrian Owen has written this, a fascinating study. He is a neuroscientist, and the subtitle, A Neuroscientist Explores the Border Between Life and Death. When we go to sleep and we have dreams, we wake up from those dreams and we pretty much acknowledge that, well, that was just my mind imagining things or whatever, or maybe I was reliving something from yesterday or last week or 2 years ago or whatever. So when we're in that condition, whether it's a coma or being operated on, so we're put under by drugs, or perhaps somebody with dementia, do we have those two states? Do we have the aware state and also the sleep state where our mind is dreaming as opposed to just being aware of what's going on around us? Do we still have those two?
We do, and you're pushing all my scientific buttons now. I love this stuff. I mean, sleep is another thing that I get into in the book because, again, it's a gray zone. Most of us I think that when you're asleep, you're gone, you're somewhere else, right? But actually, we know from brain scanning studies that when somebody is asleep, if you say their name, the part of the brain that is responsible for recognizing when your own name has been spoken will light up. Your brain actually, despite the fact that you are, quotes, asleep, your brain in many ways is still awake. It's still monitoring the outside world. Somebody outside can have a lawnmower going and will sleep right through it, but somebody beside you whispering your name and you'll wake right up. Now, that can only happen if the brain is monitoring the outside world all the time to distinguish between the relevance or the importance of a loud lawnmower and the importance or relevance of somebody whispering your name beside you. And I think that's very interesting. And we're only now beginning to understand through anesthesia, through sleep, that these different states of consciousness can exist. And whilst we think we are, quotes, unaware and unconscious, in many ways, our brain is still very much in touch with the outside world.
Can people talk themselves into having different states? Like sometimes if you're diagnosed with cancer, that's a really bad thing, and you might get such high anxiety that one of these states might happen?
That's true. I mean, yes, there is a condition in which, under extreme stress, and that could be an example where somebody could get very stressed. One can end up in this sort of a catatonic state, I suppose, where you're entirely non-responsive. It's extremely rare, and I don't think we know very much about what it's like to be in that situation. But that, for me, would be exactly the sort of thing that would excite me, both scientifically, and personally, to have a condition in which we know very little about. We know it occurs. We know a little bit about why it occurs, but what's it like to be that person? And that's really the theme that's at the heart of my book is, what's it like to be ... And, I want to know what it's like to have Alzheimer's disease. We have a lot of work trying to understand the causes of Alzheimer's disease, trying to develop therapies for Alzheimer's disease. But, socially, what for me is really important is what's it like to have it? Is the world, is it like living in a different world where you don't understand anything, but it's obviously still there? These things are still happening to you. What's it like to have had a serious traumatic brain injury, to be entirely conscious but entirely immobile, so that everybody around you thinks you're in a vegetative state, but in fact you're vibrantly alive and still there? What's that like?
Going back to my experience with the assisted living facility, there was a lady there I wanted to ask you about. She started speaking German. And I don't remember if she spoke German as a child or she never spoke German. I can't remember. But we hear stories all the time about people who suddenly can play piano or whatever. I don't know. I mean, what is the answer to that? Is we get hit in the head and all of a sudden we can play piano? That doesn't seem logical.
Yeah, I think these things are actually extremely rare. That somebody gets very good at something that they couldn't do before. And I think when you look at them, when you scrutinize those situations scientifically, you often find that they're not quite what they appear to be. So the example of the patient who suddenly started speaking German, for example, unless the person actually had some prior knowledge of the German language, I think it's extremely unlikely that they could suddenly start German, simply because the information isn't there in their brain. So it doesn't really matter what's happened to their brain. It's not that they put that information in there. However, that's not to say that what you're saying doesn't occur in some form. So I met a woman recently who told me that she'd fallen off she asked me where I thought she was from, and I said, well, you're obviously from Scotland. I recognize the accent. I'm English. You're Scottish. She said, no, I'm not. I've never been to Scotland in my life. She said, I fell off a horse, banged my head, and I've had a Scottish accent ever since. And now, it seems weird, but that's what we now refer to as foreign accent syndrome. It's a fairly well understood condition. But all that's happened is the woman's voice has been altered so that she sounds like she's from Scotland. It doesn't require that she has any knowledge of being Scottish or anything to do with Scotland. And I think many of these situations where people can speak different languages can probably be explained in that way, that what's happened is their brain has been damaged, their voice has changed, and people say, actually, you sound German now, you sound Scottish now, or whatever.
Wow. It's a fascinating topic. There's just not enough time to talk about all the questions. The book will probably answer a lot of the questions we are not getting to. Mm-hmm. It's called Into the Gray Zone. Adrian Owen, Adrian Owen. I have a copy of the book. If you want the one that was sent to me, I'll be glad to give it to you. I did find it. Where did I find it? I found it on Amazon. And did the book just come out? Must have just come out, huh? It's a brand new book.
It just came out a week ago, and if people want to know more about it, they can go to intothegrayzone.com, because they can buy it from there, and they can find out where to buy it. And there's lots of videos and additional information about many of the things we've talked about this morning.
All right, excellent. Can I squeeze in a quick question about hypnosis? Can hypnosis be done on somebody who's already unconscious? I mean, could you help them? I don't know. Come out of a comatose state if you.
Well, that's an interesting question, and I have no idea. But certainly, there's a relationship between the two. Certainly, hypnosis is again something that I would class as a grey zone state. Yeah. It's not quite clear whether you're here or you're there. Hypnotized people do interact with the world, but not in quite the same way that you and I do, and that's a classic grey zone state.
Wow, what a great topic, Adrian. Thank you so much for being on the air with us. Again, the website is intothegrayzone.com, correct?
That's it, yes.
Okay. All right, we'll take a little break. We'll be right back.
Broadcasting from the Paddock Mall Studios, this is WOCA, Ocala, Gainesville, The Villages, 1370 AM, 96.3 FM, The Source.
Fox News Radio, I'm Lillian Wu. Our immigration system could be reshaped by two bills heading for lawmakers this week.